have a much bigger responsibility towards the world than just not actively being racist myself. And I've also realized that despite the fact that I'm not consciously racist, racism has still had an effect on me. But I'm still very new to this whole process, right? I got a lot of energy and enthusiasm, but I'm a little bit clueless about all this stuff, which is kind of why I'm participating in events like these.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Casey Amon Wilson, she, her, hers. I am the, I guess, DEI professional on the panel. So I've been doing social justice, anti-racism, DEI work pretty much my whole career, so about 15 plus odd years. I work with organizations and the business process optimization and strategy. So one of my current titles is an operations strategist. And yeah, we connected, the four of us, a few months back. And as Jonathan said, we've been getting real vulnerable with each other, and vulnerability, honestly, when Jonathan and I conceived of this conversation, or this series of conversations, and just doing the work. I started back consulting full time. It was, what is the primary driver for people being able to have conversations and have difficult conversations and really do the learning and unlearning that's required to move the needle on these issues. And so vulnerability, we decided, was what we wanted to center on. So thank you all for showing up, and I'll hand it over to the next panelist.
I guess I'll go. Keishla, we'll save the best for last. Hi, I'm Jared Carroll, he, him, his pronouns. I'm the other, I guess, DEI specialist on the panel. Although I use that reluctantly, because I think a lot of times people get caught into this narrow focus of what DEI, DIB, whatever acronym you want to use, means. In fact, I was just having a conversation with a colleague this morning. I'm on a long-term contract with a tech company out here in the Bay Area. I live in Oakland. And they were asking, they said, hey, do you know any speakers who can speak at this Career Week thing the company's doing in November around on DI, diversity, inclusion, belonging stuff, or do you know anyone who can speak on like the EQ side of things? And I said, why is it an or? Why is it an or? Why does, I know someone, I mean, I could do it, but I also know many people who could do both in one presentation. And my teammates, who aren't DIB people, so granted, but they're like, oh yeah, I guess I never thought of that. And so that was that was about 2 hours ago I had that conversation. So it's super relevant to this conversation we're about to have, that as Jonathan kicked us off, like, not only are people sometimes uncomfortable with it, they almost don't see necessarily the connection of doing this work is really personal development work at its core for each of us. So that's a little soapboxy, start off there. Career-wise, I've taught social justice curriculum as a teacher. I've been a writer, strategic communications coach, leadership coach. More recently, I facilitate conversations with mostly white folks, but not only, on what it means to be racist and anti-racist and not racist. So I think that's enough about me, and we'll segue on to Keishla.
All right. Hey guys, my name is Keishla Caesar Jones, she, her, hers. I live in Austin, Texas, and I currently function as a director of customer success in the ed tech space. I'm a former educator. I've been doing unofficial diversity and inclusion work since my time in the classroom with students around issues of race, LGBTQ, just really creating inclusive spaces in the education world. I shifted from the classroom about 8 years ago, and I've been working in the ed tech space. But in that work in the ed tech space, my passion for diversity and inclusion persisted. So I had the good fortune in the organizations that I've been in to be a diversity and inclusion leader and advocate. So I work now to do the same thing that I was doing in classrooms in the corporate spaces. So as a non-professional in those terms, I really work to just bring awareness, and on a personal level, in the same way that Jonathan's on his journey of sort of figuring it out, I'm on equally my own journey of figuring out how to be an anti-racist, against myself sometimes, and unyoke myself from the systems of oppression that bind me. But I know that it can't just be about me. I have to work in a space to help other people come to those same types of realization. So, that's why I'm here, to just engage in this conversation. Have good fortune to meet this great group of people, and we've just been vibing, and we'll see what it does. So with that, we want to talk a little bit about some housekeeping. You guys are effectively using the chat, so that's pretty great. Continue to introduce yourselves. We're going to kick off our time today with sort of a general question. We've got some submitted questions that we've gotten through our social media spaces, but we really want to hear your questions. We want this conversation to be where you want it to be. We are opening ourselves up to be vulnerable to that. So we want you to use the chat. You can use the Q&A feature. You can raise your hand if you want to be taken off mute and ask your question yourself verbally. So we really want to be open and to this space of what you guys want it to be. It's not just about us. So with that, our kind of kickoff question in the spirit of what we're doing today is to really kind of talk about, let's start with vulnerability. And what role does vulnerability play in having really consequential conversations about race? So I'm going to kind of throw that to the group and see who wants to catch it.
I can give you a perspective as a white person, as someone who's brand new to this stuff. For me, I feel like a lot of the questions I have reveal how ignorant I am, and that's embarrassing. I don't like coming across as an ignorant person. A lot of the questions I have could be inadvertently offensive. And truthfully, before I ask a question, I always never really know if it's going to be offensive or not. And again, I don't want to put myself in a position where I look like an idiot. I look like an asshole. I don't want to be in a position where I have to go through a uncomfortable situation, right? Like part of this vulnerability is a matter of like how I see myself and how other people see me. Part of the vulnerability too is I just have to be willing to risk going through some awkward moments, right? And having to sit through some uncomfortable silences or maybe some uncomfortable conversations if I ask the wrong questions. So a lot of times by declining to be vulnerable, I keep myself safe from embarrassment and awkward moments, and I keep myself safe from feeling like an idiot, and I keep myself safe from looking like an idiot to the outside world. So for me, that's how I've had to kind of get used to vulnerability, and that's how a lack of vulnerability would have gotten in my way.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jonathan. I'd say for me, as a Black woman, as a person with multiple intersecting marginalized identities, I wouldn't be able to maneuver professionally or otherwise without a willingness to be open and surrendering to vulnerability in a lot of scenarios, especially having committed to doing DEI work professionally. It requires, it's not like where, I can just go in and do a job and then come home and leave it at the door, right? Like I'm putting my very being, myself, on the line every day. I'm opening myself up to attack, to whether it's intentional or unintentional, microaggressions, challenge constantly. I was a hijabi. I used to wear, I was race Muslim and I used to be a hijabi. And so, dealing with just all of the things that come with just being, in spaces where you've committed to having conversations and educating people and training people, so many of whom aren't open or interested in doing the work, but are there because, it's a requirement of their job or their boss made them or what have you. So for me in my life, in the type of work that I do and have done, just showing up a lot of times is vulnerable. And I think that's, the lived experience of a lot of people of color. We're talking about racial justice here, but anyone in the broader social justice umbrella is just showing up and being requires a certain level of vulnerability. And I think it's important to lift that up, because when we talk sometimes in terms of racial justice and having dialogues around race, our frame is often like, okay, Black people or people of color are used to having these conversations. So, it's whatever for them. It's really much, much harder for the white people to risk looking like an idiot or having the conversation, when in fact, just being in a space that can be hostile, it requires a lot of vulnerability. So I think that's an important thing to lift up.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I think that's all very, very valid. And I think when we had this talk last time, I said something, Casey's, just being a person of color every day is that act of vulnerability. And reflecting on Jonathan's statement, as more and more white people want to step into this space and have these conversations, it takes a level of vulnerability. I think for me as a person of color, sometimes I read Jonathan's post and I am terribly triggered. I'm like, what? But I know his intention, right? I know what he means. And sometimes I have to stop myself. I'm like, I start typing and I'm like, okay. I know who he is, but then sometimes I don't, like, I happen to know him, but how many other white people do we see saying things and you're like, I don't know who you are. I don't know what your intentions are, but I have to be vulnerable enough to trust that your intentions are in the right place, that you're not just there gaslighting, that you're not just there thinking about how it impacts you or trying to do performative work, because you have to perform something to start something, right? It starts with action, and then it's how we receive that action. And it requires us to be open to say, okay, that means well, and then I have to reach out, and at the risk of maybe this sucker doesn't mean well, right? And he's just trying to mess with me. So it's a challenge all the time as the dialogue gets to be more and more intensified. So.
Yeah. Jonathan, I was thinking of, well, first of all, I didn't realize, because of your infinite wisdom and maturity, I didn't realize you were so young.
Me neither.
Your age. And, in this group, the four of us, we've kind of, just kind of jokingly, but maybe there's some truth to, not that I've arrived or I'm an expert or anything, but I've been doing this work a lot longer. I'm 47. And, so when I see Jonathan, in our conversations like this, online, email, different, and these, I almost see like myself kind of, in that early stages. And what I think is underappreciated is the role of curiosity. Now, curiosity, it's not like, you have to be careful with that, because is it genuine? And I think, Keishla, we had a little interchange on one of my posts maybe a month ago or something about this, right? Like, curiosity, not as like a circus act, like, right? Like, oh, look at the curiosity. It's like, no, it's like, I'm genuinely interested in who you are, or what the lived experience of this group of people, or what it's like to live in this neighborhood, whatever the thing is. So if you're not actually very intentionally, genuinely curious, it's going to be perceived as performative or superficial. And I think that's something we have to really think about, whoever we are. So I know for me, I was about 20, maybe a little younger, 24, 25, when it clicked. And I'll share a story later about that. Like, when it clicked for me, like where my curiosity was kind of superficial and I needed to take it up a couple levels. And that really kickstarted it for me.
I want to lift up a comment that we got in the chat from Emily. Thank you for participating. And so Emily writes that I'm afraid to show what could be considered as too much support to Black Lives Matter and to the incredible Black and Indigenous people of color in my network. I don't want any part of a company that would consider my support of these people as a negative and a reason not to hire me. But in 9 months, my severance pay expires and I need to be able to house my family. Does this make any sense? Yes. It's the first time I've tried to vocalize this. Due to my privilege as a 52-year-old white woman, I have the ability to choose to support or not, but the idea of turning my back and not visibly showing support makes me feel performative, weak, and fake. Oh, and this is Kristen. All right. I will let others take this first before I dive in.
Well, first I want to say thank you for, Alana says, phew, for recognizing that your ability to choose to engage is a form of privilege. I think this whole conversation around privilege is so nuanced, and people want to see privilege as always something financial or material. And so being able to recognize when you get to engage in this work, I say all the time, my body is political. When people say, oh, I don't want to talk about politics, my body is political, and I didn't make it so. But it is what it is. But I totally understand the challenges of who your online brand is and how that speaks to people. I guess in recognizing that you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is you've got to take care of yourself and your family. And I don't know what the right answer is to say, do I take care of my family or do I stand on principles? And how can I stand on my principles in a way that sits right with my spirit? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I want to, for me, I don't think it has to be an either or. I think that we as a people, as a country, are far enough along that there are plenty of organizations, individuals, and spaces out there who not only would welcome and support and have you as an employee, but that of their own accord are, supporting Black Lives Matter as a movement, or making their own statements and having these conversations, and are very committed to doing the work. So I think positioning it as an either or sort of sets us up for like a deficit, based approach and mindset. Like I have to either be my full authentic self, or I won't ever get I won't get a job. And not to suggest that that's the fullness of what you're saying here, but that is a part of it. And I think it's only natural. It's only human. We all, especially doing any work that's, controversial, which unfortunately this shouldn't be, but we know the days and times we're living in. And it is for a lot of people, especially white people who've been taught and believe like, this is political, this is not polite conversation, we don't talk about these things, or the fallacy that even having the conversations is somehow racist, and so it's just sort of moving out of these mindsets and just conversation by conversation, action by action, resume and one job application at a time, by taking a stand. When I do racial justice trainings, I always say you have to know your why, and you have to know your stake in the game. Like, how much are you willing to stand on your principles? How much do your principles really matter? And this is the question, whether we're talking about race or any principle or value, right? Because we all have personal principles, values, and some we know, like, no matter what, I would never bend, let alone break on any of these. And then others were like, well, maybe what are the circumstances, etc. So it's the same thing when it comes to social justice work and racial justice work. And it's not just about, this is, of course, goes far beyond the social media brand or what you're putting on social media. I mean, we all have to be conscious and aware and careful. Like currently I work with a C3. There are certain things that I have to be careful from a legal and compliance perspective. But at the same time, I know where I stand, and I would not allow, the construct of any job or anything like that to dictate, yes, you can do that or not, because I'm who I am every day. Like I don't get to not show up or to hop in and out of the conversation. And so, I think just sort of breaking out of this binary idea that it's either or. I can either stand up or be quiet. There's a whole spectrum and range of ways that you can show up as an ally and accomplice in this work. Everyone doesn't have to be on the front line with their fist in the air. That's a great space, and we need people occupying that space. But there's a lot of other things that you can be doing that are in alignment with your values, and that will still allow you to get up every day and feed your family. So that's my 2 cents.
Love that so much, Casey Mon. The other thing, I'm just pasting a piece I wrote several months ago. Gosh, I can't remember her name. I'm drawing a blank, but someone I connected with back in the spring, we were talking about this concept. And she said, yeah, do you ever feel like some people are in the bomb throwing stage of the revolution? And I said, oh my gosh, that's exactly what we're talking about right here. That it doesn't have to be all or none. So I know for me, I was in the bomb throwing stage of the revolution for years, right? Where I was so excited, I was so enthusiastic, I was so ready to evolve and change and kind of just be a different person, that I neglected to care for the way I was sharing, the tone. And we can get into tone policing, which is a whole conversation. But for me, right, it was an evolution of, hey, I can still be impactful and authentic and creating the communities and amplifying the voices I want to with without being a dick, right? I was kind of a dick for like 5 years, and the people who supported me, they didn't care. They're like, yeah, right on. But anyone who was maybe on the fence or whatever was like, who is this guy, right? And so I don't know if that resonates with you, Kristen, but that idea that, as Casey said, the more you kind of understand who you are and why you care and why you want to do this, you can go about the work with a certain level of detachment in a good way. Doesn't mean you don't care, just means you're going about it with purpose and intentionality and understand the long haul that takes away a little bit of that, as Casey said, that kind of either or um, dynamic that doesn't have to exist. And when you are able to do that, whether it's a job interview or if you're a consultant opportunity or whatever the situation is, people are going to recognize that, and the people who get it, they're going to want to talk to you more, and the people who don't, they're going to want to not talk to you more, and that's fine. So I don't know if that helps, that phrase, the bomb throwing stage of the revolution. I always like that.
I don't think
Yeah.
I have. I don't think I have too much to say on the topic myself. I think that hasn't been said already, but the only thing I would say, Kristen, is that personally, I think it's less important what you do in these next 9 months compared to what you do after these 9 months, right? Got a lot of life ahead of you. This struggle for racial justice is absolutely a marathon. And whether or not you decide to take a small hiatus, I think is less important than what you do over the course of the next 30 years, So to me, I would focus the energy almost on answering the question, what will I do next once I find a job, right? Rather than what will I do for the next, 3 to 6 months.
So there's another question here we'd like to kind of raise up, and it's kind of connecting to Jonathan's path. Like Jonathan, Julia says, I'm new here. For years, I did not recognize the racial inequities that exist, which is embarrassing and also horrifying. But here we are, and now I'm becoming aware. I say stupid things without realizing I'm being ignorant. Now I just feel like I don't even know what to do because I want to help, but I feel like it could always be seen as performative or about me, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what to do to actually be of help.
Really interested to hear from Jared on this. Before, I just want to kind of connect that this is or state that this is a sort of question that we've gotten a few times over. Is this idea of what to do and how to do it to actually move the needle.
Yeah, I mean, so many different directions on this one. I don't know if people on this call, panelists or attendees, are familiar with Resmaa Menakem. So he's written, which I haven't read yet, but I will, a book called My Grandmother's Hands. And he talks a lot about black body culture and white body supremacy. He talks about racial trauma and intergenerational racial trauma. So I heard a podcast with him. It was right after George Floyd, so it must have been early June. And he was on with Krista Tippett on Being, which I hadn't really ever listened to before, but she had him on there. And he said something about, she was asking him about what, here there's this new, and this was a week, 2 weeks after George Floyd. And so this was all kind of new, this mass evolution of consciousness from white people. I think that, Julia, your comment kind of captures a lot of folks. And I think she asked him a question. Hey, white people want to know what to do, and he said it should be less about what you should do. White people always want a strategy, but it really needs to be about who do you want to be. And he said that the reason that's hard is because it's not, I don't know if anyone on this call has kids, it's not instant gratification, right? Like you try and teach your kids something and they're not going to, you're not going to know if they got your lesson until they're adults, perhaps. But you have that confidence that what you are teaching them and guiding them is going to eventually be influential. So I think similarly, if we can really think about who do you want to be and go about that path, and and what will emerge is what to do naturally. I know that seems kind of high level and maybe abstract, but I always hesitate to give specific, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, because I think it can minimize the evolution of consciousness.
I think a lot of times too, that question is often rooted in fear of making mistakes. Like I always say in my trainings, people are more afraid of looking racist than actually being racist, you know? And so if we start with the work, like you said, of being and like, am I doing the self-work? Am I building the awareness? Am I, reading and doing the resources, having the conversations, getting my hands dirty? A lot of the how, like you said, the path will emerge. It's not to sound woo-woo about it, but it's just like with anything, right? Like you don't just jump into something. You go, you prepare, you gather your tools, you apprentice, you have conversations, and then you might feel comfortable enough at that point, to actually take informed action. So yeah, I think that's a very important thing. I think it's also, and a lot of people need to hear this, I'll look directly at you all and say, you will make mistakes. You will offend people. You will hurt people's feelings. You will be called names. You will be accused of having ill intentions and being performative, and you will mess up. And if you are really in the work for the right reasons, you will keep going, right? And it's like that with anything. Like on either side, there's no one way, to do it. There's no rule book. People like to come to trainings or webinars like this or, and leave with like a 5-step, process and a certificate of completion. And I always say like, it doesn't work like that. But starting with the work, the self, starting with the self is definitely the way to go.
Yeah.
I'll just add.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
Jonathan is a model of this. So if you're not following, well, probably you are following Jonathan. If you're on this call, you probably saw his posts and stuff. But follow his posts on LinkedIn, and he models this well. Both the stepping in, making mistakes, and then absorbing the criticism. With equanimity, with humility, right? So there is a certain level of like mindfulness, kind of, who are you as a person? Are you able to kind of absorb not only in this conversation, but really anything that comes your way? And if you can, you're going to find your way through. So sorry, Keisha, I just wanted to.
No, I think that's totally appropriate. I was in two things that Casey said. So I'm going to kind of like tap into my teacher self. I used to do a lot of work with elementary social studies resources, and at kindergarten, when you start to teach about social studies, it starts with me, right? And then it's your family, your neighborhood, your community, and you build out to sort of understanding the world, with you at the center of it. And when George Floyd was murdered, I think sometimes when people struggle with, what do I do? How do I help? And one of the questions we got was, how do I support my Black coworkers? How do I support my Black friends? And when George Floyd was murdered, I got a lot of outreach from people. How are you? How are you feeling? What can I help? What can I do? Just a lot of, all well-intentioned outreach. And sometimes I think people feel like, and it's probably part of our ego, we want to be seen as helping Black people, that to help with the fight against racial justice means helping Black people. And that's not always the case. Sometimes your help in the fight against racial justice is helping white people. And I told a lot of my friends, I'm good. I've been here. I'm aware. I need to know about your family. I need to know about your circle, the people that I don't see, that I don't know, that when I see them, if they get my place here. And so I think some of the work we want to be can seem like you want a photo op because you want to seem like I'm here helping the Black people. But the best way you can help me, and sometimes in my perspective, is go help somebody else that doesn't get this. That is the person that's saying, and it goes to the question I saw earlier, what do we do when people say that the work we're doing in and of itself is racist? That's the person that I need you to tap into and work that out. So I think it's not going to be easy. And to Casey's point, You're going to get called names. You're going to get, pushed aside and dismissed. Well, guess what? That's what racism is. Being called names, getting pushed aside, being dismissed. And we're not going to fix that through activity. We think that we've had a couple of movements and marches that have been really important in making change, but we've not done the people work of racism. And Casey and I were talking about this before the call started. She asked me, how are you doing with everything going on? And, there's so many things to be concerned about. And what I'm concerned about is that we're moving to a space that we've been in before. This started out with a fight for racial justice in the justice system and our systems of government and our systems of policing. But now I got to have concern, or are we going back to a time where things that happened to Emmett Till, because that wasn't the police who did that to Emmett Till. That was American people who did that to him. And the police looked the other way. Am I concerned now for my sons and for my husband and for myself and my family that we are now shifting in a direction? And that's not coming from Black people. That's coming from white people that need a better understanding of how to shift back and get back on the path that we all thought we were on. So.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and to that question, I want us, to lift that up a little bit about responding to people who say talking about racism or racist. My personal philosophy is I don't waste my time on people who don't want to be changed. If you don't want to get it, at this point, there's Google, there's so much out there. There's more out there today than a year ago, than 6 months ago, than ever before, right? And so there's just that group of folks that is like, you're not worth the energy. That's not where I choose to direct my energy and efforts. But then of course you've got a whole bunch of people like in between who are sincere, who are rooted in, positive intention and want to help, or want to do something, want to see the world change for the better. And I think just, that's to me the better place to devote energy and efforts, because, we could talk strategy and tactics and analogies to provide and examples to give, and they're all out there. But if someone is committed to misunderstanding, is committed to not changing, we just had the President of the United States say on TV that racial justice training, he signed the executive order because it was racist, right? He's not the person that, we're going to have a successful, build a successful coalition with, he's just not. So that's my personal approach. And in terms of knowing my why and my level that, what my limits are in this work, it's not going up against, people like that. It's having conversations like this with people who are interested in engaging, who are, whether you're at the very beginning and you've never heard the term racism before, or you've been doing this work for longer, than all of us here combined. You're here because you're committed, you're in the work, and you're on a journey, and you recognize that it's going to take all of us to get it done. So that's my approach.
Another thing I'll add to that question, that was kind of originally asked about being clueless and saying the wrong things and what can I do to actually help. I think something that I learned from working with this group, right, is that asking questions like, how do I engage in racial justice without doing the wrong thing, without looking like a fool, without getting Black people angry and accusing me of things, without having my feelings hurt, without making a mistake and look like a fool. It's kind of like asking somebody, a trainer, how do I train for this marathon without my body ever hurting? Like, that's just not how it works. Like, if you are going to choose to engage, you are going to get some of these marks and dings. It's going to happen. So one of those things that you're going to have happen to you if you choose to engage is you're going to do the wrong thing. You're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to get called out. You can do your best to avoid those, but it's absolutely going to happen. You just kind of have to get comfortable with the fact that that's part of what your future holds.
Totally. Yeah, Jonathan, you brought up a question. Do you mind sharing that question?
Ooh, I don't know what question you're referring to.
You mentioned the question in the Q&A.
That was me.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jared. Go ahead.
Well, we all look alike or something? Come on, what is this?
I think it was the Jays.
Anonymous attendee says, I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. How do I talk to them about racial injustice, their privilege, etc.? great question. I have two 11-year-olds, and I'm still figuring it out. But here's one thing that I've learned actually teaching. So they just started 6th grade, my kids, and they're actually at the school where I used to teach, actually when they were born, and I taught a 6th grade humanities social justice curriculum. And every question, every lesson, every unit, every topic was through the lens of power. Who has the power, and what are they doing with it? So, am I saying a 2-year-old understands the concept of power? Of course not. But there's a difference between truth and facts. So, for example, we used to have, we had Pride Day on campus, school-wide Pride Day. And some, it was a progressive community, so no one really had an issue with it. But sometimes people from the outside would come and say, well, how can you teach about LGBT people to 5-year-olds? It's like, well, can't we just say you can love whoever you want and it's cool? Well, yeah, I guess so. Oh, so that's the truth. Oh, yeah. We don't have to get into the facts of what that means, what that looks like, right? So there are age-appropriate ways to, I don't know what the right phrase is, to prime kind of the vibe, the types of conversations you want to have with your young children when they do get 5 and 8, 8 and 11, 11 and 14, etc. Mm-hmm. That they know from you, hey, this is how we talk about things, and this is the general view we take on these things, so that when they do get older, they do have more intellectual ability, then you can start getting more nuance into the facts.
I love that difference between truth and facts.
Anonymous attendee, but
great question.
That's what I've done with my kids. Perfectly, probably not, but trying to as best I can.
And I think it's so critical to say that I think sometimes we think that we're shielding our kids and protecting them from something because we think that somehow they're not aware. They're aware. And somebody said in the chat, our kids mirror our actions. They will mirror how we treat one another. And there are things that you're doing that you think that they're not picking up on. And when you have an opportunity to, speak about something that happened in a store, or, when you're out in your community that was an illustration of injustice or power or difference, you do your children a greater service because they will see it and then replicate it. If you don't tell them that that's not the path you want them to be on, that's not how you want them to be. I'm curious to Jonathan, because you're on this journey and I know you have younger children. Are your children aware of what's happening?
I'm kind of with anonymous attendee on this one. I really have no idea. So we have talked to them a bit about race. I think it came up. We put some signs in our yard about justice for George Floyd and stuff like that. So Riviera was like, what are those signs? And we were like, well, okay, so we'll tell her, right? So I don't remember exactly the language we took, but we just tried to explain that it's hard because kids want to work in such absolutes, right? And it seems like every time we tried to explain something to her, she'd take an absolute out of it. And it was like, well, no, not really, right? So, we tried to explain to her, right, that, George Floyd was a guy who was killed by the police. And again, we had to kind of give her that talk of police are generally good, but sometimes police have these unconscious biases. Try saying that to a 5-year-old. Sometimes the police don't treat people with darker skin as well as they should treat them. And then, of course, her conclusion was, oh, my God, Javier in my class has dark skin. Is he in danger of the police? And it was like, well, no, not quite. So we tried to steer away from absolutes, right? And tried to give her, language like sometimes and usually and sometimes rather than absolutes. But still, I don't know if we did a good job with it, right? So she's vaguely aware that people with brown skin sometimes don't get treated as nicely as people with white skin, and sometimes the police don't treat them as nicely. But no, we're really out of our depth.
It's like that conversation, right? So there's birds, and then there's bees, and then the bees sting the birds, right? It's like any difficult
Right.
conversation. There's no like blueprint, no one way. There's some great books out there. I just bought Ibram Kendi's Anti-Racist Baby, mostly to support the author, but there are a lot of great books. I think it's about exposure, honestly, at a young age, because that's how kids learn, right? They're sponges. I mean, my son's only 2. I know all 4 of us here are on the panel. But exposure is crucial. Like that's how, developmental, science, we can get all nerdy about it, but we absorb through our environments, right? And so hanging around people of diverse backgrounds, having books, toys that represent different cultures. Initially when the question was asked, like, how do you have the conversation with your kids? And I thought, well, that's a whole very different topic for Black
people,
family, right? Because it's like as soon as possible you need to start understanding, like, this is what's okay for you to do, this is what's not okay, you could be
about safety, it's
danger, right? Like you cannot get away with the same things that other people get away with. So
yeah,
different.
And I was wondering that same thing, like what that, because you have a young son, right? And like in this space in your journey, Casey, I'm on, like, what do you plan to do? I have older sons and I know what I've done, but if I was raising children today,
I believe in a direct approach to everything. I mean, bet. You know me well enough at this point to know, but I mean, like, you have to know your kid too, right? I mean, everybody's different. Certain things resonate with people. Certain stories resonate. So like buying books, having books around the house, there's age appropriate videos and movies and cartoons and information. I mean, that's how a sense of pride in my identity and culture was instilled in me. And I'm grateful to have had that as a model for what to do with my son and, other kids in my life. But when it comes to the difficult topics, I mean, I remember, I'll never forget, I think I was 5 or 6 and I was singing, there was some song in the 90s about Romeo and Juliet and hot sex on the planet to get you wet. And I was singing the song and my mom came and was like, do you know what that is? And I was like, no, I don't know what sex is. I mean, at first I lied about saying it because I was like, oh, I'm in trouble, but my mom said, it's when a man puts his penis in a woman's vagina. I'm 5. I'm 5, so this is the model that I have. And I was, of course, horrified and terrified and just like, it was horrible. But I say that I give that as an example, there's no blueprint. There's no, but when it comes to these issues, in all seriousness, when we're talking about racial justice, we're talking about people's bodies, harm, safety, life, liberty, we need to be honest and we need to be direct. I love what Jared said about the difference between truth and facts. And it's important that we don't shy away from having the conversation. For those of us who have the privilege of choosing whether or not to have the conversation, we can't afford any longer to shy away from it. And we can't rely on schools. We already know that the information that we need is not being taught to us in those forums for us. So we need to be intentional about it.
One thing I'll say, another question. We're talking about vulnerability here, right? So until this question of kids, which I think was a great question, we've been talking about showing up vulnerably with your family, with your friends, with your colleagues, and having those discussions. The same approach should apply to your kids. Okay. So why do we not talk to our 2-year-old or our 5-year-old? It's our thing, especially for white folks, I think, right? Because we're afraid of saying the wrong thing, giving them too much, but really we're afraid to be vulnerable. So we need to sit. It's okay for a 5-year-old to come to some sort of absolute, as Jonathan said, and say, let them. They can sit with that uncertainty. That's okay. So that's part of the vulnerability. Whether you're talking with a 5-year-old or a 55-year-old, is being okay with not knowing and being okay knowing that the person doesn't know, right? You don't have to solve everything, whether it's whatever the age of the conversant is, right? That's part of the vulnerability. Like, I'm okay having this be unresolved in this conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those challenges. And I, as Casey said, as mothers of Black children, we don't have that privilege to delay those conversations. Just the other day, we stopped at the gas station. I'd gone into the store to purchase some things, and my husband was pumping gas. And I was sitting and waiting for him to finish. And this Black mother and her daughter were walking out of the store. And the mother had her arm around her shoulder. And she was talking to her. And I don't know what was being said. But what looked like was being said was about what you do when you're in the store and you're young and Black. And this little girl may have been 7. And so to know that we have to start talking to our children about this at that age and younger, you have to start creating that awareness and exposure for your children, so that by the time our kids are 14 and their innocence is no longer there, as in the case of Tamir Rice, and they're no longer seen as young as they are, that for that to work out for them means you got to start talking to your kids and creating some sense of awareness sooner.
I shared a resource list. I curate with my partner a master resource doc, and there is a parenting section on there. It's all kinds of resources, just because you still get the question, where do I go? Where do I start? And sometimes saying Google sounds sarcastic, so I try to be a little bit more intentional about it. But there is a parenting section with some good resources out there, and like I said, there's more than ever before. So I think this is a really great, a really timely question. I want to bring up another question that we get a lot about how, basically this idea of reaching across the aisle, right? So like, how do I reach out to a Black peer or have a conversation or talk about what I'm going through as a white ally with Black people, or even to take it a step further, this idea of diversifying my social circle and making Black friends, and just, that's a question we've gotten a bit. So what do you all say to that?
Someone asked me, I can't remember if it was on this call, the first one we did, or if it was it was in some panel thing like this. Someone said, do you asking me specifically, Jared, do you intentionally try to make friends with Black people? And I had to think about it, not because I didn't know the answer, but I had to think about how I answered it. And I said, yes, actually I do. And I said, I'm telling you this because you just answered me, or you just asked me to answer that, but I don't announce it. I mean, I'm announcing, it's kind of a meta conversation we're having, right? Like, I don't announce that publicly or say it, but I do, and that might sound weird, and I'd love Casey or Keisha, to hear your response to that. It might sound weird, it might sound superficial, but it goes back to that idea of curiosity. So I'm not going to say, hey, Black person, I'd love to be friends with you because you're Black. But I'm aware that, now my circles are pretty diverse, but for so long they were not. So when I was around Jonathan's age, 20 years ago or so, I started like, man, I don't want to be this like white, I was a college athlete, I was a party guy. I didn't want to be that guy anymore. And part of that meant having a more diverse world. And so yes, I do. I'm saying it now, kind of to share my point, but I don't say that publicly. But here's the thing, though. Just like any new potential friend, it has to be something, you got to have common interests and support each, all the things that make up a friendship of whatever, races they are. So I don't know if that helps, or I'd love to hear, or Casey, your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you have to be intentional about it. I know this was a recent post where Jonathan got some pushback, and that's part of the work, right? The reality is we live in a segregated society, and I love the work that Dr. Robin DiAngelo does on this. She's the author of the book White Fragility. If you have not read it, you must read it. And she talks. We brought her to Vanderbilt when I was working there, and she did a presentation on just why things don't change, right? And how for the majority of us, of course, she was talking about white people, but this cuts across race and ethnicity. But you grow up going to white schools, you have white friends, you have white family members, you go to an all-white church, you have all-white social outing, everything. And this is the way that society's been set up. I'm from Chicago originally. It's still considered one of the most segregated cities in America. And in fact, and it's a recent statistic, I don't remember where the statistic is from, but Dr. Tiffany Jana offers it up a lot, is that we have surpassed at this point, the segregation has increased beyond where it was during under de facto segregation, right? These are facts. And so you have to be intentional about it. And the same way I have to be intentional now as a 30-something-year-old woman making friends, period, right? I mean, it's hard, right? I'm not in school 8 hours a day and, sharing a lunch box or whatever kids do to make friends. You have to be intentional about everything. And with that same intentionality around common interest, around, whatever, whatever groundwork you have, whatever your criteria is for building an authentic relationship, you have to be willing simultaneously to step outside of, your social circle, your comfort zones. I like what you say about curiosity, Jared, and I appreciate it. I know some people, the often rebuttal is, well, we're not, Black people aren't curiosities, and we're not here to be a part of your journey. But I don't agree with that. I mean, how are we going to understand each other on a human level, build coalitions, build authentic relationships, do the learning, do the linking of arms that's required to do this work? The same way four people, we didn't know each other at all. Like, we just came across, hey, do we want to start having some conversations and opening them up? That's what's required to truly move the needle. And not to change the subject, but related to this, I just want to lift up a question that came in about more biracial relationships and interracial adoptions and things like that. Someone asked about how to support your identity without maligning one group or another. So, yeah.
I'll chime in on, Jared. Well, here's a little secret. There are some Black people who have to intentionally make Black friends. So here's a little kind of, because for those of us, we are in a very segregated society, but there is a handful of us who went to that school and they were the small number of Black or brown people. And so you grew up in a largely white world, or you work in you're at a particular socioeconomic status where the people that you're around most of the time, usually, it's what you're around that you end up sort of building on. And so for some people, and I'm one of them, for me, I'm in Austin. They're like, when you see a Black person in Austin, you're like, hey, because there's not a lot of us. We have network groups to try to find each other. We're like looking for each other. So even Black people have trouble finding Black friends. But I appreciate anybody that's making an effort to, if you're wanting to be my friend, to know me. And when you said it, like, do I notice when I'm trying to make a Black friend? I think it kind of goes back to the conversation we had. The question I asked in the first session is like, when I enter the room, do you know that I'm Black? Like, I know that I'm Black. And because it's the thing that we all have to be aware of. But I think it's, like you both said, then you move beyond that to say, I'm not just here to sort of fill a friendship quota, or have you as a token, but I genuinely want to know who you are. And so I remember when Jonathan made that post, I was sort of like, I don't know how to take that. I don't know how to feel about that. Especially if you're doing it because you want to look like you're doing the work of racial justice. But if you're doing it because, as Jared said at the very beginning of the call, that you're trying to shape how you exist in this world, then I think that's genuine. But if you're doing it to sort of for likes and checks and things of that nature, then I think that's pretty.
And people know BS. I know if you're trying to get to know me and be my, build an authentic relationship, or even come from an authentic place, maybe it's just a LinkedIn thing and we're not going to be BFFs in real life, but you want to have conversations and build a relationship the way we have. People know when you're being authentic or not, right? You're not sort of,
right,
adopting like a Tamagotchi, like, oh, you're going to be my little Black pet here, my little friend here. I mean, so it's the same approach, to just in general relationship building to this topic as well. Any thoughts on the specific aspect that I don't remember who lifted it up about interracial children, multiracial, not maligning folks, one side or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge all the time, when I'm not biracial, but I have friends who are biracial. And the challenge is always how the world's that it's how they see themselves, but it's equally how the world sees them. And in the case of President Obama, when it's convenient, they're like, "Oh, but his mom was white," but that's not how he functioned in the world. And so, I always respect when biracial people are able to balance the two, but I would imagine it's got to be terribly difficult when you live in a society that won't let you straddle spaces. So I think that's got to be pretty challenging for them, that you're either not black enough or not white enough.
Yeah, I think the binary thing is very, I in general try to stay away from binaries as much as possible, but I think it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
There's this idea that celebrating and affirming my identity or someone's identity is the same as um, denouncing yours.
Yeah.
And that's not true. That's just simply not true. I come from a multiracial family. My grandmother's half white. And you can be, and that piece that you spoke to, Keishla, about how I identify versus how I'm identified by the world is reality, right? So, I mean, I can be, biracial, multiracial, whatever racial all day long. But if I look black or if I have an accent or whatever, that's how I'm going to be identified. And we have to be aware of that piece. But when it comes to like conversations, intra-family or personal relationships, celebrating someone's, Chinese heritage or blackness or, Mexican identity is not the same as saying we're going to and being honest and real about white supremacy and systems of oppression isn't the same as saying, yeah, so we need you to denounce your mom or your grandmother who's half white or your entire half, of your family. Like you can celebrate, we can celebrate the wholeness of who we are and still be honest with each other, with ourselves, and lift up the marginalized the aspects of our identity or the identities that we hold that are marginalized.
I mean, my view on this, and of course, I have no experience and very little authority in this area, but I think it's probably not fundamentally different than what we all go through, because the challenge is how do you present a realistic picture of what the world was like and what the world is like today without painting people in the picture of good guys and bad guys, right? And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my children, is try to describe a realistic situation without painting anyone in the picture corner of being these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. So I imagine it's fundamentally the same for everyone, or at least similar.
Yeah, and that's again to bring it back to vulnerability, whether it's online or in a family, dinner, or the in-laws or your kind of maybe less than progressive neighbor, whatever, all these different your colleagues. I know it's different because we're not in offices and in spaces as much as we have been typically. It's okay. I think when we hear something that we disagree with, our first reaction is to rebut it, is to fight it or to shut it down or to say, "Oh my God, how can you think that? Why would you say, whatever the." And I found that it's not only more vulnerable but more effective and actually more interesting to say, "Tell me more about why you think that way." Right? Because I think, especially, I think everyone on this call, this is what the work we do, whether officially or kind of unofficially. We want to like have the answer or stop the hate or stop the ignorance, right there in that interaction. And it never, I don't know if it's ever happened that way in the history of humans, right? So if we can be vulnerable and say, you know what, gosh, what that guy just said was really awful, and I'm going to ask him if he can explain a little bit more. And what three things are going to happen? He's going to ignore you because he wasn't expecting it, right? He's going to double down and continue to be a dick, and then you have your answer. I think someone talked about it. Casey, I think you were talking about it earlier. Okay, that's not a conversation I'm going to pursue, right? Or he's going to see that you're willing to maybe have a conversation and might loosen up a little bit and have a dialogue. Now, where that dialogue goes, who knows? And there's so many variables and context. But if we all can be more genuinely curious and not attached to our rightness, some things can open up for us, and it's more powerful.
And I'd say that's the work, like this whole conversation of what do I do? What action do I take? I want to support Black Lives Matter. I want to support Black people. I want to do something. Doing that, like that piece, like those pieces, having those conversations in your own life, like in your own workplace, in your own family, like that's how the needle starts to move. We all have a network. So trying to hop over here into my lane, into my network is not where you're going to have the most impact. So like map out your areas of impact. Like what are your connections and the roots you have, and sort of like where do the branches lead for you? Where can you have the most impact? And start there. And that's, I think, where we'll really start to get the practice, and continue on that journey of learning, unlearning, bumping our head, stepping, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. I mean, there's no easy way. You're either in the game or you're not. But that's how we start to see change in our own lives and move the needle, I think, is doing that. That's what you just spoke about, Jared.
There was a comment earlier, Alana made it. And so she says, she wavers between incandescent rage and willful hatred and ignorance against racial justice activities and policymakers and citizens. And so I think it's always that challenge. Jared's always so zen. Like every time we have this call, Jared comes in and he Yoda's the thing and do or do not. And you're like, Jared's like all zen all the time. And you're just like, gosh darn it. But sometimes I'm angry. Like sometimes I'm frustrated by it and I'm tired and I'm worn out. I know you got the books, Jared. I know. But what do you do when you're just angry? You read a book.
I go for a run. Yeah, I go for a run. I go to whoever my trusted circle is and complain. I teach Zumba, I eat a bucket of ice cream. I mean, I think this kind of overlaps with the conversation. This topic, right, that I often get is white people saying, is it okay to vent or talk about my frustrations? I think that was a question someone asked. Is it okay to talk about my frustrations as a white ally with Black people and Black peers? And, you want to do no harm and be very careful about these things. But I mean, we are all human. We're going to experience natural human emotions. When you get, you might think you wrote the best LinkedIn post ever, or you were really, really standing up and doing the right thing. You were shining today on your ally tip. And then someone comes in and like, you're racist, you are performative, go sit down, we don't need you, we don't want you. And you're just like, I'm fucking done, right? We're human beings. Like, we're going to experience it. We have to give ourselves grace. I mean, that's the truth about it. It's not easy work. If it were easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? So I think we just have to give ourselves permission to feel the feelings. It's just like with anything, and then take a break, deep breaths, and then get back in the game.
And I would say, obviously we're virtual, we're in a pandemic. And so some of these spaces are the only spaces for us, but don't make the keyboard the only space that you're doing this work. I mean, and sometimes I get I'll see a post, I'll type my response and then I'll delete it and I feel better.
Here's the thing, and I know not everyone on this call, on the panel, or I don't know everyone's profession who's on the attendees, but I'm a writer, so my work is writing just in general, and DEI, right, whatever you want to call it, right? And so when I write, whether it's on LinkedIn or for a client or wherever I am in a public space, most of the time, not always, sometimes I tip one way or the other, but most of the time I'm putting out a strong opinion as a conversation starter. And it's up to you whether you comment, ignore, read, and don't, and just lurk, whatever your thing is, it's up to you what your take is on it. I try to be consistently, here's my opinion, here are my thoughts, here's my approach, here's my vibe, and tell me what you got. If you're interested in having the conversation, we'll have it, but not getting attached to that. So I love, you're right, I'm Zen, I've read all this stuff. Mindfulness is a whole I mean, that's so central to just my philosophy of life,
Right.
not this subject, with raising my kids, with, I mean, the shit show that's going on in the world with everything, right? Like, so that's my approach. And if I can share that and people resonate or learn something or something, but if you don't, that's fine too. So I try to be very um, mindful of not saying, here's what I do and here's what you should do. I try to have the tone of, I invite you to consider this perspective. You might find it helpful. And then,
Right.
and then done.
And that's a big challenge because there's a lot of don't do it this way, do it that way. It should be like this. And so I think that's why, we all really appreciate, Jonathan's all about the videos. He's trying to get us to make videos, y'all. I don't think any of us that's his thing. We're going to get there. But I think it's, we get a lot of policing of the process from all angles. And I think that's a part of that frustration, that you have to be prepared that somebody is going to come in and say, you shouldn't do it that way. And, so Jared is zen. Casey Amon is direct, probably somewhere in between the two sometimes. And, and Jonathan is Mr. Curiosity, and we're all doing it. And I think that's the thing. And we're all doing it with good intentions and purpose. So I think that's hopefully a takeaway that everybody can get.
I want to lift up a couple more questions. I think we have time for one, maybe two. One thing I saw earlier, so one question from Tamu is about ways that are most productive for younger Black people, Black women, to try to start conversations with older white people about race and racism, especially in the workplace. But before getting to that, there was a comment or question earlier about this idea of vulnerability as a defense mechanism, specifically around sort of pandering to white people's comfort or, in lieu of having the direct conversation. And I just wanted us to take a second or a minute to just really clarify what vulnerability is and is not. And if you aren't familiar with the work of Brene Brown, you should definitely get familiar. She is definitely, to me, one of the guiding lights when it comes to just the whole topic of vulnerability. And she provides to me one of the best sort of definitions and ways to do vulnerability. But vulnerability is not about, pandering or catering to pacify the feelings of those who are oppressing or doing harm to people. So I just wanted us to speak to that for a second before getting to Tamu's question. Basically, white fragility. Vulnerability is not pandering to white fragility.
So it's a 20-minute TED Talk, so watch it, when you have time. That's Brene Brown's, and actually I need to rewatch it because it's been a while since I've watched it. But
the book is better than the TED Talk.
Which book is, because I have a couple
Daring Greatly. I mean, she's written a lot at this point, but Daring Greatly is like the seminal foundational work for me, but yeah.
Oops, and vulnerability.
And we've got 4 minutes, just after
Yeah.
that.
Well, here, someone else.
Like this.
It's kind of floating around my head. Someone else, if you're ready to jump in, do it.
Go for it, Jonathan.
Jonathan, come
I don't know
on.
if I have a great definition of vulnerability or even totally understand the question. My understanding of vulnerability, it seems like there is no potential overlap between what vulnerability is and what was brought up about like pandering to make white people feel better. So obviously we're working with different definitions of vulnerability, but I don't think I understand it quite well enough to answer.
I think it's like, Casey, if I'm hearing correctly, is that I as a Black person, I shouldn't have to give all my effort to making a white person feel comfortable about the fact that racism is real, it exists, it's a thing. I know you just open your little eyes to it, which I still, that whole statement still bothers me sometimes.
I can read the comment. So it says, I'm wavering between, it's the incandescent rage question. How do we not alienate when there's a certain point when vulnerability becomes a state of being, a defense tactic within the white community / white adjacent community? I'm sick and tired of feeling like we have to check our language on the rights and dignity of Black and brown people to make it more comfortable or inclusive for people who are openly against Black Lives Matter. And
that's the kind of the space that I'm moving in, that you I think it's about style. Jared has a style, and, but sometimes you just want to say things that are, and I know he does that sometimes, and sometimes he does it in a way of sort of posing to try to kind of open something up. But I can hear it and totally understand the comment to say, as a Black woman, it gets tiring to always feel like I'm having to check myself or wonder if that's making you comfortable or if my Blackness is too much for you. And it's always a challenge when people have that conversation about bringing your authentic self to work. And I think sometimes when we make that statement, when I want to be authentic and my whole self, oftentimes many white people, I think, go to some stereotypes of what it means to be Black all day, and not realizing that the amount of self-check that we have to do for your comfort really is as a detriment to you, right? Because you don't get the best of me, either at work or in my relationships, because I'm constantly monitoring myself. So, and that when you sort of unfurl it, it is a place of frustration that you're always aware that you're having to do it all day long. And then when you get home, it's sort of like letting this go, and you feel your body differently, and you wish that you could be that way all day. So understanding that that's the existence of Black people, when somebody pops off at you, you got to know where that's coming from. And you're going to have to take it if we're all going to be able to sort of relax our shoulders a bit. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that relates to Tammy's question. I mean, it depends on your style and approach, but I believe in, naming the thing. There's a lot of power in naming it. And so if we're talking about, I'm giving a presentation tonight actually on diversity in the workplace and what that means, and anti-racism in the workplace. And it's about naming it. I'm a HR, business, management, I do operations work. And so I think whether it's from a policy and process perspective, how these, policies that are not inclusive, that are not equitable, that are racist, are baked into an organization structure. We have to start there. And just opening up the dialogue and letting people know, in meetings it comes up in water coolers and lunchrooms, and naming the thing and being, identifying yourself as someone who's willing to have the conversation and do the work, because not everyone is, and not everyone has to be or should be. I mean, sometimes you just want to go to work, you don't want to talk about, I'd love to go to work every day and just not have to think about these things or worry about these things and just do my job, right? But if you're someone who is interested in going that route and opening yourself up to having the conversations, there's, it depends a lot on you and how you want to do it. But I think naming it and modeling it are good starting points.
That's true. Well, everybody, we have come to the end of our time. Jonathan, you want to close it out?
I don't know if there's a whole ton to be said that hasn't been said already, but thanks everybody for coming to this conversation. Again, we will be sending out a recording afterwards that you can share with people, that you can rewatch yourself. If you're not already, certainly connect with all four of us on LinkedIn. I have no idea what the future holds for us, but if we ever do something like this again, we'll certainly be promoting on LinkedIn. And I would just kind of encourage all of you to try to find ways to be more active in the struggle for racial justice, get more comfortable with your vulnerability, and do not let your discomfort of vulnerability, your fear of vulnerability be the thing that holds you in place and prevents you from acting and participating in the struggle.
Nice summary. Thank you, Jonathan.
Nice.
Thank you all so much. May the force be with you. Stay safe out there.
Bye.
So foolish.
Have a great day. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Alana. Onwards for sure. Thank you, Stephanie. Alicia. All right. Bye, Stephanie. Thank you for coming. That's my girl right there.
I feel you, Shaza. Hope I'm saying your name right. It's rough. It's tough. To answer your question, no, they don't. The people who we're talking about, at least, the people who are forcing you to appease them are probably not thinking about how they're asking you to do that is affecting you. So yeah, that's